Thank you for the opportunity to speak here at your conference this afternoon, speaking to you from very cold Sydney, Australia at the moment. So I hope that someone's introduced me. If they haven't, my name's Sarah Wayland, and I'm going to talk to you today about my recently completed PhD study exploring hope and missing people. The early formation of the research question identified a moment for me as a potential researcher of hearing the concept of hope for the first time after meeting a woman whose son had vanished a number of years ago, and the last known sighting of him had been through CCTV footage as he was leaving work later that evening. She explained to me, almost now 14 years later since her son vanished, that the feeling of hope was around wanting justice for him and hoping that she didn't have to live the rest of her life without knowing what happened to her son. I found that I catalogued over the years of my therapeutic work, working with families of missing people and then switching to an academic research role in 2013, was that I collected each of these observations of hope along the way and reflected on the stories that were shared with me. And what I did was then pull together those hope-filled narratives, and my understanding became more detailed, richer, as I progressed through my career of practitioner to researcher. So when I began this study, the research question became, what do the stories of the left behind tell us about hope and the way it's experienced when someone is missing? So what is hope? Looking back through my literature review, which I presented almost 2 years ago, at the first International Conference on Missing People, which is soon to be published in the Death Studies Journal, around exploring what hope means in a context of ambiguous loss. So hope is a complex emotion. The theorists speak of it as its intangible qualities. And even going further back in time, it was interesting to note that Plato referred to hope as the foolish counsellor. So this mythical idea of hope being something that taunted people rather than something that created some possibilities for people. So more recent hope theorists like Zhevny and Snyder speak of hope in a context of future-oriented narratives. So if we think about hope in our everyday lexicon, thinking, well, I'm hoping that I'll get that job that I've gone for as a parent. I'm hoping that my child will sleep through the night. We tend to talk about hope not in a present term concept, but in a way of thinking forwards to the future. So what I noticed in reflecting on all of the literature that I gathered to understand what had been spoken about in terms of what it meant to be left behind when someone is missing is that hope has been a persistent inclusion in all of those narratives, both from a law enforcement perspective, from a media perspective, and from the voices of those with lived experience. Yet hope had never been researched in a context of how it might impact the ambiguous loss of being left behind. So what methodology did I use? The project was grounded in a narrative inquiry framework bound to a reflexive praxis. As a social worker for the last 20 years, I wanted to bring together my capacity to be able to assist people in telling the stories of their lives, and then to be able to analyse those stories to come up with some ideas around what hope might actually mean in an ambiguous loss context. The stories of hope and loss were shared with me by 19 family members of missing people, all with experiences stretching from 9 months post-missing to up to 34 years. There were 3 phases of data collection, which you'll see on the diagram that I have pulled up in front of me. And within that, I included in phase 1, 5 narrative in-depth interviews. Following those in-depth interviews, I conducted a short-term thematic analysis to draw out what those themes were of people that provided me with insight about hope in a one-to-one capacity. After that pause, I then conducted a virtual focus group using the Moodle online technology with 14 participants scattered across Australia, and taking into account being able to pull in those people in geographically isolating areas to give them the possibility to become part of a study. Following that, I then sent out an invitation to all 19 participants again, asking them if they would like to get back in contact with me to clarify their involvement in the study and also to clarify some of those answers that they provided. Because as many of us know, when someone is missing, the day-to-day occurrences of what's happening in the media or how they might be feeling, or perhaps significant anniversaries, can sometimes shift the way that people provide the experiences of what it actually means to be living long-term with the loss of a missing person. 8 individuals out of those 19 decided to re-engage with me at that stage. Following this, I conducted a full thematic analysis of the narratives provided by the participants, and with my research team, Associate Professor Mafamwi Maple, Dr. Kathy Mackay and Dr. Jeff Glassick, I was able to explore the narratives and then start to uncover what the findings might have been of my study. It's important to note that the results cannot be generalised. However, given that each of the participants had contact with law enforcement, some with legal services, including the Coronial Office, therapeutic agencies, and all of them had had contact with the media at some stage, it's important to note that their voices can inform the way that families of missing people have responded to in our community. So what were the 5 key findings of the doctoral study? The first being that hope existed within the participants' narratives, which provided meaning to their bond with the missing person. Secondly, that hope splinters once the physical loss of the missing person is realised, and that from a time frame perspective is realised at different intersections, dependent on the actual investigation and the person's connection to the person that was lost. Thirdly, that hope and time are intrinsically linked, where hope does not decrease over time, but it signifies new attachment to life post-loss. So this toing and froing sensation of hope for the missing person and hope for the self in terms of the capacity to live long-term with not knowing. The fourth finding was that there is scope to identify hope as having both public and private narratives. So public narratives are openly shared with others, including the media, and the private narratives seem to be those that were not willingly shared by those left behind when engaging with the media and the broader community. And finally, that hope allows families to exist in the liminal space between their missing person's presence and absence. Importantly, the study highlights the shifting foundations of hope, where its inclusion is not duplicated between family members, but rather that hope is an individual engagement impacted by external forces. So the conundrum here is acknowledging the space in between. What I found in thematically analysing the participants' narratives was something that I termed the tiered schema of hope. So what emerged from that first thematic analysis conducted post-phase 1 interviews was that creation of that tiered schema. In this tiered space, there were shifting ideas of hope that overlap and engaged with each other. The first tier of hopeful explorations, not to be confused with the word hopeful, or positive statements, but statements that related to hope being part of the context of people learning to live with loss. These statements are ones where the participants demonstrated that through sharing their story, that a self-described capacity to use hope in a meaningful way, to understand their experience of loss and the way in which they were surviving in spite of them, was useful for all of the participants. For one woman, the compassion of a police officer who gave her time to sit and talk offered her with hope. She explained to me that when the police make time to listen, it means that they might be able to do something. Another family also felt that when police showed a special interest, it validated their hope, as you can see by the participant narrative on the screen. On the opposite end of that tiered schema were statements where hope was lacking, or what I termed as hopeless statements. Again, these were not hopeless statements, but ones where the person's engagement with ideas of hope provided little respite from the person's capacity to enact mastery over their life. So this lack of mastery sat amidst the ambiguity, usually relating to the lack of information about the missing person's whereabouts or frustrations about the law enforcement response to their investigation. For one participant, the partner of a missing man also found that in the early days of the disappearance, when she was struggling with that loss of him being gone, was that she found that the comments from one particular police officer who said to her, "He's probably necked himself and he's not going to come back," devastated her. She felt finality in his words, as well as shame in terms of not having the answers about what might have really happened. The police officer eventually apologised, but she felt that it took a significant time for her levels of hope to return. The middle tier is the key feature for everyone in the audience to think about today, allowing movement between tier 1 and tier 3. And in this space that I termed as multiple weavings, this is a space that occurs and is seen within the conversations where the participants spoke of almost a both-and approach. So that's a concept noted by Emeritus Professor Pauline Boss, of moving between ideas of both absence and presence all at the same time, where people existed in two spaces, a liminal space that was created by hope shifting. The participants confirmed to me that a dual process of hope existed, one in which the multiple weaving concept brought together periods of hopefulness alongside a tenuous connection with hope, where ambiguity existed within that space, yet that space became the new normal for those left behind. So what is the law enforcement and legal role in their engagement with hope? The police role in a missing persons investigation is not to provide emotional support. The participants in the study acknowledged this statement. However, the close connection between the identified needs of families of missing people, so namely to have the missing person back, and the goal of police intervention, to locate the individual or ensure their well-being, suggests that the intertwining of contact at significantly traumatic periods can lead to unintentional support provision or lack thereof, given the distinction between police being hope enablers, as the participants termed them, or hope detractors in certain circumstances. The participants of the study provided examples of the ways that hope was dented by the language used by the police in terms of describing the possibilities of what might have happened to the missing person. Families indicated that their lived experience of being the best possible person to have an understanding of the nature and presentation of the missing person who was absent, as noted by Foy in her study in 2004, was invalidated by the way that the missing person was spoken about by law enforcement, that these occurrences had lasting impacts on the participants' emotional well-being. The application of the results of the study also highlighted the potential for the police to impact the emotional well-being of people left behind. Participants' reflections, particularly on their shift of worldview post-loss, incorporated that social discourse that suggests that if a person can't be found, that the police will step in and locate them. The realisation that this wasn't the case was perhaps the most challenging part for families of missing people. There was a mix between the families interviewed in terms of their thoughts on the investigation as a way of holding on to or being made to let go of hope. As one participant explained to me after watching a police officer speak about another missing persons case and suggesting that that person might be deceased, she remarked, "How dare you say that? How do you know what she's going through?" in terms of how hopeful that family might be about the ideas of the missing person returning. She felt that the harsh tone of his words forced the family to concede hope without any news to the contrary. Finally, the heightened anxiety about a potential outcome in the missing persons investigation can lead to a hope hangover, as some of my participants coined the phrase. The participants of the study identified that this period of time was a time for law enforcement to tread gently, to make sure that they understood that rise of anxiety around the hope that perhaps this would be the outcome that would lead to locating or bringing the missing person home, and then that decline, that down period following that, almost felt like a sense of a hangover for participants, and that law enforcement needed to acknowledge that they had to share information about the possibilities of the person coming back, and if they weren't coming back, what it might actually mean for those left behind. So where to from here? The findings of the study identified that families understood that those around them would engage with different ideas of hope than themselves. And I think that that's incredibly important for law enforcement. The findings of this study are not for you to hold on to hope as similar to the family, but understand that each person involved within that missing persons investigation will hold on to different types of hope. But those different types of hope need to be honoured. The family said that they do not believe that it's the role of others to detract from their hope, and that they don't need a reality check about what might happen if the missing person doesn't come home. The study identified some of the following recommendations relevant to this topic. The The first being that hope is present for all families of missing people, but that hope emerged at the same time as the disappearance. When reflecting in the literature review about the role of hope and bereavement, hope tended to come to the forefront a significant period of time after the loss. Yet for families of missing people, they hold on to hope right from the very beginning. But that over time that hope shifts like it does in a bereavement context, where it perhaps might become less about hope for the missing person and more hope for themselves, in terms of how they might continue on the rest of their days without knowing what happened to the missing person. And that the prevailing fear that many of the older participants reflected on is that one day they might pass away without ever knowing what happened to their missing person. The second issue is that hope is attached to time, like I noted before in the significant findings of the study. Yet the ways in which the community, the media, and law enforcement and the left behind themselves often silence this shifting perspective is something that should be noted. The results of the study speak to a quietening or silencing of hope over time, where fewer questions are asked, where media inquiries are minimised, where hope shifts to a realm where we focus on being realistic rather than optimistic. Honour that does happen, but that it has to happen in the family's own time, not perhaps what the investigation is suggesting. That hope has public and private narratives is probably the third finding that I think is most relevant for the talk that I'm giving here this afternoon. That hope reached pivotal intersections that correlated with the reason why the person vanished, primarily homicide versus emotional health within my study. The time since the disappearance and the embracing or shifting of hope of those around them and in the wider community impacted upon a person's capacity to speak truthfully about their connection with hope. The family said that the less people asked about their hopefulness, the less they felt open to talk about the different feelings that they had, irrespective of how long it had been since that person was last seen. The results demonstrated that these hope stories can be different in terms of the physicality of the missing person's return. However, the ways in which individuals turned in when their hope narratives became internal conversations took precedence, rather than feeling safe about sharing openly with the wider community about still holding on to hope. So like all good researchers, I think it's important to note what requires future exploration. And I think the thing that we don't know enough about, both in terms of the return to missing population, but the other issue is ambiguous loss across the lifespan. We haven't yet been able to map the longitudinal shifts of hope for families of missing people. And in doing that, it would provide a more detailed understanding of ambiguous loss that hasn't yet been recorded. Focusing on the role of media outlets, law enforcement, legal services would enhance the community's as well as the service providers' acknowledgement that hope for the missing person differs to hope for the left behind. Additional research on the social discourse of ambiguous loss and the lack of capacity to sit with the unknown might create enhanced outcomes for the left behind. The results of the study, as well as broader discussions centering around hope, loss and ambiguity, conclude that the impact of the loss of a missing person stretches far beyond the stories told of those left behind. The role of the media in perpetuating this idea that we just need to talk about locating the physical person, and the inclusion of law enforcement in shaping the left behind's connection with hope, as well as those private narratives that perhaps the community might not be ready to hear, like in some circumstances where the participant said that it wasn't as simple as hoping, that for many hope was pain, provided scope for challenging the assumptions that when loss occurs, the only option is to hope for a resolution. I'd like to leave you by reading out one final quote for me that epitomised the purpose of my study. And I'd also like to encourage anyone that has any questions to please email me or Skype with me like many of you already do, to talk a little bit more about the findings of this study, but also moving forwards as a missing persons research community to ensure that we begin to tell those stories that have not yet been told. As the mother of a missing son, missing for 10 years, said to me, I think there are two paths of hope. You have a different hope in the beginning. It's a sharper hope, isn't it? Though it does come back to who you are. I mean, if you're a pessimist, you're not going to attach a lot of hope, are you? If you're an optimist, then yeah, I think that hope is within your life and you'll channel it in different areas. Like a twig, there are different branches of hope. It's a much softer hope for the future, isn't it? It's a very poignant, sharp hope when someone goes missing. Thank you.